have been looking at the question of whether or not Jesus is a defensible solution to the problem that man created for himself when he disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden. Basically, does the Old Testament make a sufficient case that Jesus was the Messiah to fix the harmed relationship between God and man? Following the same timeline as when the biblical texts were written, we've made it all the way from Genesis, written by Moses, 1400, 1200 BC, down to Daniel, written somewhere around 540 BC, give or take a little bit. And over that 700 to 900 year time span, God shared many attributes about the Messiah that we found. So before our time in the book of Daniel, we had these items as things to look out for. We knew that he's going to be from the line of David. There's going to be a star, born of a virgin, wilderness messenger, and Bethlehem was mentioned. And over the past few weeks, we've gone through each of the verses that pointed to these things. We had this list of items that we could use as a test to see whether or not something was the Messiah. And obviously this is a nice long list that we've compiled here. So, if we have something that's occurred and we say to ourselves, I wonder if that was the Messiah, these are the various things that we can look at and see whether or not it matches. Now, though, I want to jump back to Daniel, which we had gotten into last week. We're around 538 BC here, and we saw at the beginning of chapter 9, in verse 2, that Daniel understood by the books the number of years. Daniel was thinking in terms of years. After this verse, Daniel prayed fervently to God. He was asking that God turn his anger away from Jerusalem. And so that's what follows verses 1 and 2. And we make it to verse 20. Gabriel shows up, and we can see the man Gabriel reached Daniel. Moving on to verses 22 and 23. Gabriel told Daniel that he was going to explain things. He said, "O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand." Verse 24, we had 70 weeks. The Hebrew word translated weeks is shabuim. That literally means sevens. I probably said that incorrectly, so if you know Hebrew, feel free to correct me. Some translations actually say 70 70s, or 70 sets of 7 here. Pretty much every biblical scholar agrees that this usage of the Hebrew word weeks means 7. So Daniel is thinking, and as shared earlier, that he's thinking in terms of years, so this gives us useful information. Gabriel shares with Daniel that 70 periods of 7 will occur, and then everything will be complete. And when I say complete, I mean complete. If we look at the things here that Gabriel said was going to happen after the 70 periods of 7, we know that the transgression will be finished. The end of sins. Reconciliation for sin. To bring in everlasting righteousness. To seal up vision and prophecy. Everything will be complete. And to anoint the most holy. So after the 70 weeks, everything will be done. But he doesn't just end there, though. Gabriel gives us more information. We go on to verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Remember, we started our study with Genesis 3 back around the beginning of time, basically. We've made it all the way to around 540 BC, and we finally have Messiah introduced. So it's taken that long for us to actually get this word Messiah that is pointing to a liberator. This is the first instance, and frankly, one of the only instances of the word Messiah in the Old Testament as it points to the liberator, the Redeemer, the Savior for the Jewish people. Before this point in time, the Jews did not go around and say to each other, I can't wait for the Messiah to come. Because that word had not been applied to this yet. Only with Daniel chapter 9 did this get associated with a future Redeemer. Anyway, we have 49 years and 62 times 7, which is 434 years. 483 years total, whenever you add those two up. After 49 years, the street shall be built again and the wall, even in troublesome times. And then, in verse 26, Gabriel goes on to say that after the 62 sevens, which is the 434 years after the 49, that Messiah will be cut off and will not remain here. Other translations say that he'll have nothing, they will have no one. So basically the Messiah will be gone, is what we can read that as. So Messiah will be cut off and he'll be gone after the 483 years. After that, there will be more things happening. We'll get to that in just a second. But as far as what the Jews needed to concern themselves with when looking for a Messiah, we're done with that. We have the 49 years plus the 434 years, and then Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. That's kind of what we had made it to last week. So we know that if we're looking for a Messiah, we now have a specific thing that we need to be looking for that I've added down here at the bottom, and that is the command to rebuild Jerusalem. When that command happens, that starts a clock. And if we're wanting to check and see if something was the Messiah, we know that we've been told that the city and the sanctuary is going to be destroyed after the Messiah is cut off. That's what the verse 26 told us. So we've got the 69 sevens. That takes care of the messianic prophecies. But let's go ahead and see about that final week, because we've been told that there's 70 sevens. We've talked about 69 of them. It's really easy to look back on this passage in Daniel from where we're at now and see how the events played out. And it's easy for us to cloud our judgment on this whole study because we already know what we know about the New Testament. But if you were a Jew looking at the information that they had at that time, though, this would have been tricky for them to understand. But let's look at the second half of verse 26 and verse 27. So we've been told that the Messiah is going to be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be the flood until the end of the war of desolation. So let's just start out with that. So from the year 2024, we note that Gabriel did not say that this final 7-year period had to immediately follow the previous 483 years. Gabriel does not say that. He does not say that they're going to be exactly consecutive. And as a matter of fact, in the last half of 26, we see that the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. We know that the Messiah died around 30 AD, give or take a few years. And when was the city and the sanctuary destroyed? 70 AD. So we already have a gap of 40 years that's included in this time frame after the first 69 sevens. So we already know that there's a gap there. The question is just how long is that gap? We don't know. But we know that there's a gap there. We know that from here in 2024, we can look at verse 27 and say that has not happened yet. The things that are talked about in verse 27 are still to come. They're sometime after where we're at right now. Remember when I said that last week that parts of Daniel, like this verse, would have been very difficult to understand without Revelation. They're tricky enough to understand with the book of Revelation, but they would be very tricky without the book of Revelation. Explaining this verse is not the point of this study about the Messiah. But whenever we combine verse 27 with what we have in Revelation, verse 27, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even till the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. If we combine this with Revelation, we basically know that the prince or the Antichrist is going to have a covenant confirmed for a final period of 7 years, which we see as being the Great Tribulation. And halfway through that, 3.5 years in, The prince who is to come is going to end sacrifices, and the abomination of desolation will occur. This is future. Thoughts? Nothing too deep, but thoughts. Yeah.
It says that it'll end the sacrifices, but the Jews aren't sacrificing now, are they?
Correct. Because the temple has to be rebuilt before this can happen.
And that's why some of your folks that are really focusing on end times will say, when they start rebuilding the temple, get ready.
Then you know.
Yeah, kind of like we've talked about a timer that's going to start when the command goes out to rebuild Jerusalem before the Messiah.
Uh-huh.
Pastor Joel has just mentioned that people are saying that there's another event that we need to be looking for from now moving forward. That is all, yes?
Is it a literal rebuilding of a literal?
That is the assumption.
Okay.
For the sacrifices to be able to occur, there would need to be a physical temple. That is all I am going to say about Daniel at this exact time. We will be revisiting what he said, though, I promise you. Let's continue on with our march through time. So Daniel died around the time that Persia defeated Babylon, which is, let's try out this nifty little toy that I got, which is right here. And this marked the approximate time that the Jews were given a fair amount of autonomy and allowed to return to Jerusalem from exile and start poking around. They had thoughts to rebuild the temple. They lost interest for a couple decades. They were discouraged. They probably remembered that Solomon's temple had been grand. They knew they weren't going to be able to accomplish that. But that's kind of the time frame that we're at now. And this is where we're going to pick up the prophecies of Zechariah. And he's down here in the green, right there. And Zechariah and his contemporary Haggai, which is also right there, they both encouraged the Jews to finish up the temple, to actually finish what they had started and get the temple rebuilt. And the temple was finally rebuilt around 516 BC. So we're in the period right around that time where Zechariah is doing the prophesying. And as we move through Zechariah, he's going to spend a lot of time prophesying and encouraging. We make it all the way to chapter 9 of Zechariah, and he's prophesying with an incredible amount of specificity about what is eventually going to be Alexander the Great 200 years in the future. So Zechariah is giving incredible detail about Alexander the Great. And Alexander is going to be around 340 BC. And again, we're around 516 BC. So we're a good 180 years before that. Then in verse 9 of chapter 9, we're told, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly and riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey." This does not give the impression of a warrior coming in on a white horse. We're told he's a king, but he's coming in on a donkey. "I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem. The battle bow shall be cut off. He shall speak peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth." These two verses give us a couple of things that we can add. First of all, we have that he's going to be riding on a donkey. That's another thing that we can look for whenever we're looking for the Messiah. And we know that he's going to be the ruler everywhere. He's going to have dominion from sea to sea and from, the river to the ends of the earth. So we can see that he's not just one to be the ruler in Israel. He's the one to be the ruler everywhere. And he's going to be riding on a donkey. So as we move forward in Zechariah, though, He goes from foretelling Alexander the Great in the 340 BC time frame to talking about the Romans who will be coming after that. And the Romans are going to show up around 60 BC. But in chapter 11 of Zechariah, there's a curious parable between Zechariah, who is channeling a future messianic figure, like a shepherd, and his flock of sheep. The shepherd has done a lot for the flock, but the flock is described as being doomed to slaughter. So that's where we're going to pick up. And the shepherd is talking to the sheep and asking them for payment for what the shepherd has done for the sheep. Then I said to them, if it is agreeable to you, give me my wages, and if not, refrain. So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver. Curious that we have a couple of specific things described here. A payment of 30 pieces of silver is provided. Not 20, not 40, but 30. Now, if you've read ahead, you might be thinking, aha. But I will point out that 30 pieces of silver at this time in history was the standard cost of a basic slave. So one could make the case that the sheep offered to pay the shepherd, but only a paltry amount. Only what a basic slave would be worth for all of the great things that the shepherd has done. Let's keep reading, though. The next verse would probably not have made any sense at all to the readers at the time. 13. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, that princely price they set on me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter. Here we have God saying, give it to the potter. Princely price is sarcastically stated there. Basically, what a joke that they think that that paltry amount is what I'm worth. Anyway, the 30 pieces of silver are thrown into the house of the Lord for the potter. In my opinion, this doesn't give us anything to look forward to in knowing that we're looking for a Messiah. But if we're trying to confirm whether or not someone was the Messiah, there are some oddly specific details here. So, we know that we can look for something related to 30 pieces of silver and money being thrown into the house of God for a potter. This is the type of information that, where are we at now? 516 BC. It's not going to make any sense. You're not going to say, oh, that's the Messiah. Even when this happens, even when the 30 pieces of silver are paid, even whenever it goes to the potter's field, 30 AD, give or take a little bit, you're probably not going to put two and two together. But later on, when you're reading Zechariah, and you read things like this, you're going to start scratching your head. You're going, wow, that was written 500 years before the man that said he was the Messiah showed up. And then these things happen very specifically. So again, this is the type of information that we can look back on and say, okay, this is a good indication that we're talking about the Messiah here. Zechariah then goes on to give more prophecies, some of which people point to as being for the Messiah. Zechariah 12, 13. Feel free to read those, but when I read them, they look more like a solution that's pointing to the second coming of the Messiah. So I'm not going to include them here, but we'll talk about that in a bit. We're moving on from Zechariah. We're rolling through the years quickly. As a reminder, at this period in time, Judah was a province within the Persian Empire. As I had mentioned, Persia generally allowed the Jewish community a significant amount of autonomy in their religious and internal affairs as long as they remained loyal to the empire and paid their taxes. So they had a fair amount of ability to do things. And we've got Zechariah in the 515 BC time frame. That's about when the temple gets rebuilt, and we continue marching through time. 60 or 70 years after this, around 460 BC, Ezra led a group of exiles from Babylon to Jerusalem during the reign of the Persian king Artaxerxes I. Ezra brought a copy of the Torah with him, and he started teaching and enforcing its laws among the people. After that, we go to Nehemiah. In Nehemiah chapter 1, he learns that Jerusalem is in ruins. And we pick up in chapter 2. And we've actually talked about this in the last week or so, if you remember. So in chapter 2 of Nehemiah, we're given some pretty specific timing. And it came to pass in the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. We know that year. We know that it was either, well, we know it pretty close. We know it's 445 or maybe 444 BC. Close to 100 years after Daniel, for instance. Because Daniel was around 538 BC when he was writing what he wrote. Now we're around 445 BC. So 100 years later. We even know the month. It's in the month of Nisan. It's actually pretty rare in the Old Testament for the specific month of the Jewish calendar to even be mentioned. As a matter of fact, if we look at the Old Testament months being mentioned, in the Torah, the festivals and the feasts, they were described as being in various months. But once you get past the Torah mentioning these specific festivals and feasts, we have a few instances where the months are mentioned. First of all, we have when Joshua led the people across the Jordan into the Promised Land on the 10th day of the first month. That's a pretty big deal. It's kind of understandable that they would mention exactly when that happened. 1 Kings records 4 different months related to Solomon and the temple being built and dedicated. Again, that's a pretty big deal when the temple was being built. Ezra and Haggai, they record a few specific months related to the temple being rebuilt. Again, pretty big deal. Esther records some specific months related to the letters being sent to the Jews saying that they were going to be exterminated, and the Feast of Purim was instituted. Again, we have a feast coming on, we have the Jews being exterminated, pretty big deal. And then we have this instance in Nehemiah, which makes us think that this might be a pretty big deal too. Let's go back to Nehemiah though. It came to pass in the year of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart." We have a sad Nehemiah. And why was he sad? Verse 3, into verse 2. "So I became dreadfully afraid and said to the king, 'May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire?'" Remember back in chapter 1, Nehemiah had learned that Jerusalem was in ruins. He's sad about it. He tells the king about it. And the reason is that because Jerusalem is in ruins. Artaxerxes tells him to go fix it and gives him the power to do so. In verse 4, "Then the king said to me, 'What do you request?' So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild.'" And then we skip a few verses and into verse 8. "And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me." So Artaxerxes told him to go fix Jerusalem, and he gave him the power to do so. You might say that the command was given to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. That's crucial. Did you catch what I just said?
The command was given.
The command was given to restore and rebuild Jerusalem.
Tick tock.
Tick, tick. This started a really important clock. We're going through the Old Testament chronologically, and we just can't leave this out. This started an important clock. Let's jump back. Daniel, verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem, there's going to be a period of 49 years and 434 years. There's a bit of debate about exactly when this command talked about in Daniel, verse 25, is given, but there's a lot of consensus that we just saw it in Nehemiah. A timer has begun. The start button has been pressed. We now know when we're looking for a Messiah, we don't have to look for the command to rebuild Jerusalem. We have the command to rebuild Jerusalem. We now know that we can look for 49 and for 483 Jewish years after 445 BC. This is a little bit complicated, but during this time in history, Jewish calendars averaged out to 360 days per year, not the 365 that we have. There are some fascinating rules regarding Jewish leap years that I've actually recently learned about that were formally added in the 4th century AD, but at this time, back in the BC, Jewish years averaged to 360 days per year. And we obviously see it as 365 days. So if you do some math, that means that on a calendar system that we can understand, in our calendar years, we've got about 48.3 years and 476 years. You do the math, then that means that we have 397 BC and around 31 AD, we're going to have Messiah cut off. It's math.
I'll trust you.
So around 397 BC, you can expect Jerusalem to be rebuilt. And around 31 AD, Messiah will be cut off and nothing will remain of him. This is precise. For the Messiah to be cut off, the Messiah has to be. Scholars have taken the month of Nisan, 445, 444 BC, as given by Nehemiah as a starting point, and calculated down to a specific Sunday in AD 28 up to something as specific as March 30th, AD 33. That they say corresponds to Christ's entry into Jerusalem at the beginning of the Passion Week. I will leave that specificity to you to figure out. But even if you figure in a little bit of wiggle room for when a certain event might have occurred, such as the specific time that the command to rebuild happened, it might have been it was somewhere around that time. This is a hard timeline. The Jews had a reason to be very, very watchful around this 25 to 35 AD time frame. Even if you're off by a little bit here and there, they needed to be watching carefully between 25 and 35 AD, or somewhere in that time frame. And they might have been able to, at that time, they might have known the specifics and been able to look much closer than that. I don't know. Thoughts? Questions? How many of you are seeing this for the first time? Pretty neat, isn't it?
I can see how the Jews in that time questioned it, missed it, but I don't understand how they miss it now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned. Yeah. And I just heard a comment from the crowd. There are a lot of people that are obsessed with these numbers. And if you go online, you can dig up things where they're saying, oh, they're off by a week, they're off by 4 days. I'm not going to bother with that level of specificity, but you get the general idea here.
There are a lot of people who obsess so much that they try to predict when Christ is coming back.
Yeah, and
Of course, we've got plenty of times where they were wrong.
well, and we're told very explicitly that no one knows the time or the hour.
So they were aware of. I don't really know much about what books the Jews believe are biblical and spoken by God versus, false prophets or whatever. I was wondering if it was possible that maybe they didn't even believe that the book that was just talking about the
Was part of it?
Yeah, was part of what they believed.
It's in their Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, several weeks ago, we actually went through the Hebrew Bible, and the Hebrew Bible contains all of the books that we have in our Old Testament.
Okay.
Now, they obviously place special emphasis on the Torah, which are the first 5 books, which we call the Pentateuch, but their Bible contained all of the books that our Old Testament has.
They're just not in the same order.
They're not in the same order. Not entirely.
So then they would be able to put these pieces together and hence why.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we know that they had Daniel because that's where they got the word Messiah. So,
They're just stubborn.
Or blind. They're blind.
They were.
They're blind.
There's reason for them to be very precautious of false prophets, especially around this time. So I can understand their hesitancy, but when they see what they see while you
well,
there,
and we're going to get into this. I love these thoughts though. But let's move on. Nehemiah was the governor of Judah for around 15 years. Near the end of, or shortly after his governorship, the prophet Malachi steps onto the scene. We know very little about Malachi, actually. The name Malachi means messenger. My messenger, basically. The Septuagint gives its meaning as angel, since angelos is the Greek word for messenger. Malachi is a small book. After chapter 1, verse 1, where it says, the burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi, the remainder of the book is the direct word of God. God speaks of his love to Israel, his hate for corrupt priests and social sins, and then chapter 2 ends with a question in verse 17. You've wearied the Lord with your words, yet you say, in what way have we wearied him? In that you say, everyone who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delights in them. Or, where is the God of justice? Note that question at the end. Where is the God of justice? Let's read on to find out in verse 1 of chapter 3. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord, whom you seek, will suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. A messenger is coming, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord is coming immediately after that. So there will be a messenger. We already have that on our list of things to look for. We saw that, I believe it was in Isaiah. I think we saw that there was going to be a messenger. So we don't have to add that, but it's important that it's here. Next 2 verses. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. So Elijah will be sent. I mentioned on the last slide that it was important that the messenger was mentioned. Here we have a note that Elijah will be sent. I can tell you that this is a very important verse for the Jews. If you ask a Jewish person about this today, they will tell you that they are waiting for Elijah. That is the thing that they're looking for. They're waiting for Elijah as a sign. Anyway, so we have, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. So there's Malachi verses 5 and 6. Any questions before we move on to the next prophecy?
So they don't believe that they saw a messenger yet.
That is correct. They don't believe that was Elijah. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, let's move on. There are no next verses.
Really? We've entered the 400 years.
We just read the final verse of the Old Testament.
Cliffhanger.
This begins a period of silence where God did not speak. The silence that would last beyond a year, beyond a decade, beyond a generation, beyond a century, and extend to hundreds of years and many generations. The very final verses that God revealed to man before this silence was to look for a messenger. God did not hide that detail. Approximately the final thing he said was that, in case you missed it back from the prophets, watch for a messenger. The Jews and the scholars of this time would have had a lot to chew on. The period of 7 sevens would have been the first to pass. Some theorize that at the end of this 49-year period, that Jerusalem would have been fully rebuilt. Not just the walls, but the streets, everything. That it took them 49 years from the command from Artaxerxes for them to actually do not just the walls that Nehemiah talked about, but streets, everything. Some theorize that Malachi actually wrote his final verses 49 years after that command. We just don't know. We're not given specific details about this period of 7 sevens beyond what we've already read. We know, though, that after 483 years from the command, that the Messiah will be cut off. That we do know. After this 49-year period, we know that kingdoms are going to rise, kingdoms are going to fall. Daniel's prophecies concerning the Gentile empires that's going to rule over Israel, they're going to come true. Zechariah's prophecies concerning Alexander the Great, who was Greek, they come true. The translation of the Old Testament text from Hebrew to Greek, which is known as a Septuagint, that happened between the 3rd and the 1st centuries BC. So all these things are happening there. Daniel's prophecies, which we didn't talk about in this study, concerning the little horn that's in chapter 8 of Daniel, would be realized in the Greek ruler Antiochus Epiphanes around 160 BC. This guy was bad news. His aim was to eradicate the Jewish religion, to bring cultural uniformity to his kingdom. He forbid key elements of the Jewish religion. He initiated the destruction of every copy of the Torah that he could find. He set up idols in the temple at Jerusalem. He forced himself into the Holy of Holies. He destroyed the scrolls of the laws as much as he could find. He sacrificed pigs on the altars. He plundered the temple. He carried off the artifacts to help finance his war campaigns. He murdered innocent Jews. He banned circumcision. He burned the scriptures. And he punished anyone who disobeyed him. This guy was bad news. This was around 160, 170 BC. Daniel talked about him. He described him as the little horn. Go back to Daniel 8 and read about that if you want to. It's a crazy thing what this guy did. This led to the Maccabean revolt. And maybe you've heard of the Maccabees, but the Maccabean revolt was led by a family of Jews whose last name happened to be Maccabee, and they got rid of the Greek rule. This was around 160 BC, so not too long after Antiochus Epiphanes. The rededication of the temple after their revolt led to the Jews instituting the festival of Hanukkah. So that's where Hanukkah came from. The Pharisees and the Sadducees originated around this time. So after the Maccabean revolt, and the Jews were kind of back in control of themselves. So we had Pharisees and Sadducees, and also the Essenes. And there was a lot of internal strife between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they couldn't agree to things. And that kind of led to a civil war. And that lasted until the Roman ruler Pompey took over in 63 BC. Everyone following on this? Through all this, silence from God. Nothing from God. The only thing that people had to do was to read, reread, digest, and ponder everything that they had from the Old Testament.
And watch for a messenger.
And watch for a messenger. And pay attention to that clock. And what had God told them through the prophets? Well, we've got lists. When we look at the criteria of what we have to look for, there's a little bit of seemingly conflicting data. We have some of the things that we understand happened at Jesus' birth, but then we have other things that are closer to his ministry 30 years later. We have a long list of things we can use to test a Messiah. The Messiah has to accomplish all these prophecies made by reliable prophets, or else it isn't the Messiah. We've talked about the prophets. We saw that they were to be tested with what they said to make sure that their prophecies come true, or that's a sign that they're not a real prophet. Each of these prophets that we talked about gave a whole bunch of prophecies. Many of them came true immediately. Some of them, such as the ones talking about the Messiah, had not. But because of the reliability of the ones that did come true immediately, these prophets were to be trusted. And of course, some of the prophets, such as Daniel and Isaiah, talked about things that haven't yet happened. But we know because of what they talked about that did happen reliably, that we can trust what they talked about that's going to happen.
Much of what you see there is, he said he was the Messiah, but they wouldn't have really known he was until after they crucified him.
Ah, that is an excellent point.
Look at all those things. They're basically right toward the end of his life.
Yep,
That came true.
that is absolutely true.
That's the test right there.
A lot of the things that we see here would have been hard to identify even when it was happening. Only afterwards can you look back and say, wow, that was the Messiah. But you're stealing a little bit of my thunder for the end.
Sorry.
But that's okay. That's okay. It's a really good point.
I just happened to notice as I was looking at you.
So these things are prophesied. They all need to come true. Every single one of them. But as we think about what the Jews were thinking of at the time, I'm going to hit you with a bunch of Old Testament verses. We're going to go through these quick. The majority of these we've seen in the past few studies, but I want to focus on something specific. Genesis 49, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. Numbers 24, this is where we got the Star of Bethlehem concept. But after that, a scepter shall rise out of Judah, and batter the brow of Moab, and destroy all the sons of tumult. 2 Samuel 7, I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Psalms 2, I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Psalms 110, till I make your enemies your footstool. Rule. Isaiah 9, of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. Isaiah 11, he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. 42, till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastline shall wait for his law. Jeremiah, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will raise to David a branch of righteousness. A king shall reign and prosper, and execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell safely. Daniel 7, to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed. Micah, the one to be the ruler in Israel, and we've already seen that he's the ruler everywhere. In Zechariah, we saw just a few verses ago that he'll have dominion from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. Over the 400 years of silence, the Jews became hyper-focused on wanting the Messiah. And as we know from the New Testament, they were wanting the Messiah because of what we have in yellow. Because he would be their liberator. He would rule everywhere. Oddly enough, this is another example of what happened to the Jews again and again and again in the Old Testament that's known as a cycle of sin or the cycle of apostasy. They were going along well. They turn from God. God allows the Gentiles to overtake them. They eventually cry out to God, and God brings deliverance. That cycle we see repeated again and again and again in the Old Testament. Look at where we're at now. The northern kingdom had been under Gentile rule from 722 BC. The southern kingdom from 586 BC. They remained under the Gentile thumb until the Maccabean revolt in 160 BC. So 500 or so years, depending on where you're at. Then they had 100 years of civil war and fighting amongst themselves. And then the Romans came in around 60 BC and started another cycle of oppression. Put yourself in their shoes. What were they looking for? They were looking for another deliverance, just like all of the ones before. They had been told that a Messiah is coming and that he's going to have dominion. He'll sit on the throne of David. Enemies will be his footstool. He will rule forever. That's what they're looking for. That's what they're focusing on. They probably kind of understand this historic cycle that their people have had of falling away, Gentile oppression, crying out, God saving them, and it all being repeated later. They wanted a fix-it-all, no more worries about being ruled by the Gentile solution. And they had crafted the Messiah in their minds to be that solution. We're going to look now at how what we think of as the Messiah Jesus accomplished that. But when I say now, I don't mean now, because we're out of time.
Just add, it's worth adding to what you just said, because I had the privilege of listening to D.A. Carson speak, which he writes commentaries and everything. And he spoke on John the Baptist, and the story of John the Baptist. And you know, if you've ever wondered, John baptizes Jesus. He's there when all this, you know, the Spirit descends like a dove and all this thing, and he hears the words, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased." Well, later on in his life, John the Baptist is in prison, and he sends his disciples to Jesus. Are you the one, or should we expect someone else? And D.A. Carson points to the very things that Kirby just said. In John the Baptist's mind, he's looking for that liberator. He's looking for someone to rule with a rod. And Jesus isn't fitting that picture. So he asks, are you the one? And that's why he asked that question, is because he was looking at the very things that we see.
Yep.
Aren't John the Baptist and Jesus, like, weren't they close? They grew up together and he still questioned him? Are you sure?
They were close relatives, actually. Lived several miles apart, but yeah. And yes, John the Baptist questioned. And there's a message for us in every part of this.